What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number 458. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources, and joining me on the line all the way from Denver, Colorado, late at night, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, are you ready to talk some Guilds of Ravnica?
Oh, yeah, we're here on LR After Dark. We're ready to roll.
Indeed, yeah. We're recording much later than we normally would, but Luis is very accommodating because I'm going to be in Las Vegas doing coverage for the World Championship, and finding time to fit the show in could have been problematic, so we're getting this in the day before I take off. Thanks for that, Luis. I want to remind you, the show's brought to you by channelfireball.com, where you can pre-order Guilds of Ravnica. We're going to be talking about it for the whole show here. We've got the rules and mechanics episode, as well as some initial impressions on the set and the archetypes within it. If you get excited after having listened to this show, well, channelfireball.com is the place to go to pre-order. You can get a box of it or some assortment of box and singles, whatever it is that you happen to need, they're going to have it. And the first opportunity they have to ship it to you, the day that Wizard says, go, you may ship, they will do so. And you'll get it in the mail just as soon as humanly possible. Channelfireball.com for that. Of course, the Patreon is where you can go to support the show. Got a couple of things for that. First, Patreon playmat giveaway. I still got a big pile of them, giving away one every show. And this one is going to go. And by the way, this is the art for Sun Cleanser from GP Detroit. This one's going to go to Jeff Fullinus from Boonton, New Jersey. Thank you, Jeff, for your support. And I've got that on the pile to be shipped out probably when I get back from Vegas. You also get to ask questions on the Patreon question of the week. This one comes from Parker, who says, "Hi, Marshall and Luis. Thanks for all the great advice over the years. My question is about dealing with rude players at GPs or PPTQs. I understand that F&M is more of a situation for the local game store itself to deal with, but as a competitive event, I feel like there's a level of professionalism that's expected of players. Is there any good way to handle another player making rude or insulting comments to another player? Calling a judge seems like a good first step, but is it all just hearsay and there's not really much the judge can do unless they heard it firsthand? Thankfully, I've only ever run into this situation once," he says, "but it caught me so off guard that the offending player had already walked away by the time I'd processed what happened." And that's been my experience too, Parker, is that these things, while they do tend to stand out, are actually quite rare. They don't happen that often. For the most part, the players that you'll meet at a PPTQ or GP are going to be courteous to you, but occasionally you'll get somebody who's tilting or just rude. And this is a good question. Luis, what would you do if you were sitting there and you saw somebody say something unsportsmanlike or mean to another player?
It's a little interesting. In general, I think calling a judge is fine. Certainly nothing wrong with that, especially if you're not comfortable with confrontation. In general, what I would tend to do if I saw that happen near me was just kind of ask that person, like, "What's up?" Like, "Hey, man, that's not cool." Or, "Hey," just, you can kind of confront people. You don't have to be super aggressive about it, but you can confront people and just be like, "That's not a cool thing to say." Like, you shouldn't do that, or in whatever way makes you feel comfortable about it. Like, the judges are there to adjudicate stuff like that, and they will back you up if someone's being like a complete jerk. But like, you can also just kind of, even just a call out yourself of like, just basically challenging them will go a long way. I find most people fold to that sort of thing.
They do. But like, also you like that's a little tougher, right? Because like,
yeah, and I think
if Luis Scott-Vargas is scolding you, then you're probably more likely to listen than random person who you don't know. That is
totally true. And as we've discussed on the show before, I do think that I have somewhat of not necessarily a responsibility, depending on what a comment looks like. I mean, a lot of people are capable of defending themselves, but I think it's one of the ways that you can use that for good.
Definitely.
But I also would just kind of read the room, take the temperature of the situation. If you don't know if these people are friends, or if the person who they're berating looks intimidated, then yeah, it's really good if you can step up and help them, because like, they're not able or, in a position to be able to do that themselves necessarily.
Yeah. For me, I agree with Luis. I think it's totally fine to say something, but I really like your advice about reading the room, because there are certain situations where people will say stuff and that no matter what you say, it's not going to matter, right? If they're just being completely over the top jerks, just swearing at somebody or whatever, you saying, hey, why are you doing that? That's not going to,
Right.
make a good situation. You can tell them, hey, you just need to walk away or something along those lines to make sure that nothing escalates. But yeah, there's also just nothing wrong with calling a judge and saying what you saw. I mean, nobody wants that type of stuff. And like I said, I do want to reiterate that thankfully these things are quite rare, but Magic can be a frustrating game. And also some people are just not nice people. And sometimes when those things come together, you do have people, have a little bit of a blow up at the table, and it's totally fine to let a judge know. Okay, let's get into this, Luis. We've got quite a bit to cover for the Guilds of Ravnica rules and mechanics show, because from a big picture perspective, we've got, we're returning to a world that we've actually visited twice before, back with Ravnica City of Guilds and the block around that, and then return to Ravnica and the block around that. Now we've got Guilds of Ravnica, or as it's colloquially known, Return to Ravnica. And it actually is. Look, when you see that, you're like, really? We're going back again? But I'll tell you what, this is one of the coolest planes that they've built, because with 5 colors in Magic, you can make 10 distinct color pairs, and they call those guilds. They first solidified those and their kind of identities back in Ravnica City of Guilds. That came out in 2005, if you can imagine that. And each guild, of course, has its own name and own identity. And basically, they just took the color identities of the 2 colors, figured out how they'd combine if they were, merged into one kind of entity. And then they made a new set of kind of ideals, and this is what this thing gets, and this is the type of strategies that it goes for around each of those. And this time, we're going to get half of those guilds. So in the first set here in Guilds of Ravnica, we are not getting all 10 of the combinations. We're getting 5. We're getting Dimir, which is blue-black, Izzet, which is blue-red, Golgari, which is black-green, Boros, which is white-red, and Selesnya, which is white-green. Okay, and just like a super overview of each of those, Dimir tends to be kind of card draw counters, discard, evasion, kind of sneaky stuff, I guess is how you would describe it. Izzet tends to be instant and sorcery based. Generally speaking, it cares a lot about either casting or having instants and sorceries like in the graveyard or your hand or wherever. And it has this kind of random experimental element to it. It's hard to describe until you see some of the cards, but there can be randomness involved. Golgari is usually just means there's stuff going on with the graveyard and the creatures in the graveyard. Boros is basically always the most aggressive guild of all 10 of them. It has a lot of haste and small attackers, stuff like that. And then Selesnya tends to be about tokens, or at least the creatures on the battlefield, and making them good, like taking advantage of having a bunch of creatures. In Guilds of Ravnica, each of these guilds are going to have their own signature mechanic. So let's get into those right now. The first one is for Dimir, and it's called Surveil. And Surveil is actually quite simple. It's really similar to Scry, which is Scry evergreen now, Luis?
Scry is. You'll see Scry 1 way more often than any other number, because Scry 1 plays really well and Scry 4 does not. But Scry is evergreen, and I think that's part of the reason that we're seeing a lot more Surveil 1s and 2s than any other number.
Right. And, the way that it works is every time you see Surveil on a card, there'll be a number after it, like Luis just described. And then to Surveil, you look at that number of cards from the top of your library and you put any of them back on top, and the rest go in your graveyard. That's it. Normally with Scry, you put the rest on the bottom of your library. This just puts them in the graveyard. And that might sound like a small difference. And from understanding how the mechanic works, it is. That's the only difference. But from a power level, it's actually quite a bit higher. It should be noted here, Luis, just because I think a lot of players are really averse to getting milled, like in any capacity, let alone if it's for their whole library.
A lot of players, what's better, Scry 3 or Surveil 3, and they'll point to Scry.
Right. There's something that feels bad about being milled, even though it's not bad. It's actually, in this case, quite a bit better for you.
Yeah,
right?
one of the things that Magic gets to use is you have a lot of different resources, and your graveyard is actually a resource, much more so than the bottom of your deck, because look, we're going to get to them in a second, but Golgari has Undergrowth. It counts the number of creatures in your graveyard. Izzet has Jumpstart. It, lets you cast spells from your graveyard. So the Dimir mechanic, which actually touches both those guilds on each side, works quite nicely with those mechanics. So it is, I think, substantially more powerful than Scry.
Yeah, I do too. So that one's actually probably the simplest of all of the new mechanics. So we'll just kind of go right past that. But just remember, Surveil's better than Scry in almost all scenarios, and that you want to look for good things to put in your graveyard that other cards might benefit from. And then the next one is for Izzet, and it's called Jumpstart. And Jumpstart is a variation on Flashback for players who are familiar with Flashback. Basically, instants and sorceries can have Jumpstart. And if they do, they let you cast that spell from your graveyard. The difference is that you pay the mana cost for whatever the spell is, and then you also have to discard a card from your hand in addition to any other costs that you pay. So it lets you get a free spell out of your yard, but it does cost you something in that you have to discard a card on top of it for the second time that you cast it.
All the Jumpstart cards just have a Jumpstart, like you just pay their cost, right?
Yes.
It is not like Flashback had Firebolt, which is 1 red, deal 2, 4 in a red, flash it back. All the Jumpstart cards just say Jumpstart.
That's right. And that, I mean, traditionally this is quite powerful. Right. The ability to play a spell twice is really strong. I mean, that's value. That's what we love on the show here. It's just one of those things where you always have to be aware of having that extra card on your hand. Now, there's some details here that can be important and you should understand before you go to the pre-release, which is that the discard part is actually part of casting the spell. So you'll have to do it just to get the spell on the stack, meaning that even if the spell gets countered or the target ends up being invalid or whatever, you still had to discard that card before you could even cast the spell. So you are discarding the card regardless of what happens with the spell after it. So that is something that you have to keep in mind. And then no matter what happens to the spell, if you're jump starting it, it's going to get exiled rather than go to the graveyard or any other place. Whether it resolves or doesn't, if it gets bounced, if it were to go anywhere else than the stack, it's going to go into exile. That way you can't do things like abuse it and keep casting it over and over again.
Now, this is a much more fair version of Flashback.
Yeah, it is. It is. You're never getting most Flashback cards cost more to Flashback, but occasionally they're cheaper. Yeah, that's never happening here.
Yeah, you're getting a mana discount in general, but you are having to give up a card, so there's not inherent card advantage, which the Flashback cards tend to have.
Right. So you really kind of got to want to do that thing again. Although, we all know how it is when you get late in the game and you've got an extra land in your hand anyway, it's a pretty low cost to have to discard it in some situations. Also worth keeping in mind, any timing restrictions stay on the card since you're still casting it, even if it happens to be for its jumpstart cost from the graveyard. So namely, if it's a sorcery, you can still only cast sorceries, during your main phases. So don't think that just because it has this jumpstart ability that it means you can do it whenever you want. So it gets you value. One of the interesting things, though, is that what if you were to use the discard outlet to your benefit, right? Like maybe getting something in the graveyard that you wanted there anyway, like another jumpstart card. Although when I think about that, I think maybe I just want to still cast the jumpstart card twice. But still, you could do a lot worse than, discarding a card that you can cast from your graveyard later in the game, right?
Yeah, and some of these cards are also somewhat situational, like, 1 blue mana to give a creature ++1 in flying. Like that's the kind of card that gets a lot better later when you're just trying to finish them off. You don't necessarily need that on turn 3. So maybe you end up casting the jumpstart draw card and then you cycle through that other card and whatnot.
Right. The other thing, and I mentioned this before, but I want to reiterate it, is make sure that if you're playing an Izzet deck with jumpstart cards, that you don't just play out those last lands for no reason.
Right.
If you've got an extra land in your hand, and even if you don't have the jumpstart card yet, that could be really valuable down the line to allow you to jumpstart a card later. So unless you need it, this deck is going to incentivize you to keep not only lands. I mean, would you even go further to keep, let's say there's a 2-drop, but it's a stalled out board where the 2-drop's really not adding anything to it. Would you keep that in your hand?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that's going to be key, and we don't know every single card, right? We don't know exactly what it's going to look like, is that the jumpstart cards, because they have the same cost to cast and flashback, mean that you have incentive. You have the ability and incentive to not play land number 6 if you have a low curve in your Izzet deck. So I could see these decks being very disciplined about what cards they don't play, whether it's the 2-mana 2/2 when your opponent has a bunch of creatures that can block it, or your 5th land or 6th land, just to make sure you can jumpstart all the things you need to.
Yeah, it's interesting because normally when you think about flashback, you think, well, I want to play all my lands because it gets more expensive. But if you got it into the graveyard by casting it, you can do it again. Okay, let's move on to the next guild. That's Golgari. And Golgari's signature mechanic is Undergrowth. And Undergrowth is a little bit more vague than the first ones that we've seen.
It's kind of what we call an ability word, where we've seen this before with the spirits in Kamigawa, for example.
Landfall.
Landfall, yeah. It just describes a whole class of things that care about the same number, which is the number of creatures in your graveyard. But what the cards do varies wildly from card to card. And so you can't make any assumptions until you have to actually read the cards.
That's right. And it's just kind of tough. So some of the conclusions that we can take are that a good Golgari deck will probably need ways to get cards into the graveyard, namely getting creatures in there. So I would keep my eye out for some type of enabler. And when we do the set review, that's what I'm going to be looking for. What are the ways specifically at common that I'm going to have in this set to get cards either from my hand, but more, better would be from my graveyard from my library into my graveyard. And then also another thing that I'm thinking about, just very big picture, is that if I am doing some type of self-mill strategy, I wouldn't be surprised if I wanted to be pretty heavy on creatures to maximize my number of undergrowth hits. This is something that came up in Innistrad back in the day where, we were casting cards that cared about the number of creatures in your graveyard, and you needed to make sure that your decks had some type of critical mass. Now, you don't need to go crazy with this, but I would just tilt the scales a little bit towards playing an extra creature or two rather than playing, a mediocre spell or two in my decks, just to make sure that if I am trying to do the undergrowth thing, that I can do it. But as Louise said, it's very card specific, right? Yeah, you can't say how good undergrowth is until you know which undergrowth cards you have.
Right. And I think one of the cool overlaps is going to be with Surveil, all the black Dimir cards. And that's where doing exactly what you said, having like 18 or 19 creatures in your deck is good, because if you're casting these Surveil cards, you can just bin your bad creatures.
Right. Totally.
There very easily could be like, give a creature -X or X number of creatures in your graveyard. We've already seen like 4 mana 0/0, but +1/+1 for each creature in your graveyard haste. Like these are the kind of cards that the difference between 4 and 5 or 3 and 4 on these cards is really big. So even playing like kind of below rate creatures like 2 mana 2/1 no text, right? This is not a card you tend to want in expert level expansions. Even playing that card because it powers up later 2 of your other cards, that could really justify it easily.
Yeah, totally. So keep that in mind. I have a feeling that the undergrowth deck is going to be the most finicky to build because you will need some type of enablers, but you may not know yet which payoffs you have yet. And it's going to be very much specific based on which cards you have that say undergrowth and how much do they pay you off for getting the big undergrowth thing going. So that one I think is the most nebulous of all of them. The next one.
Well, another thing to mention, by the way, is you're going to run into situations against undergrowth decks where you like don't attack your 3/3 into their 2/2. Because
that's a good point.
Because you see these like sick payoffs and you're just like, okay, I need to like wait till I get a flyer and go over the top. Because if I kill their 4th creature, all of a sudden they're going to get to play this card that's just going to punish me for doing that. It's going to lead to some kind of weird games. So
that's a great
I'd be
point.
prepared for that.
Yeah, because I was focusing on these enablers, but another enabler, block, right? Like you can get your creatures in the graveyard through other, more normal game means. I'm assuming if you want to go nuts with it, that you'll probably want to have enablers. But Luis is totally right. I mean, your opponent may even just be chump blocking or actively looking to trade off in basically any situation that they can for any card that you have just to get their undergrowth going as well. That, by the way, is another reason to make sure that you're on the heavier side for creatures, because again, you need to have more of them on the board. Boros. Now, this mechanic is interesting because on the surface, it actually looks quite simple, but when it plays out, it's kind of not in some scenarios. It's called Mentor. And Mentor it says whenever this creature attacks, so a creature can have Mentor. There's no numbers or anything attached to it. It says whenever it attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature with lesser power. So just as an example, if you've got a 3-powered Mentor creature and a 2/2, and you attack with both of them, you can then say, okay, the Mentor ability is going to trigger when this thing attacks, and I'm going to put this on another attacking creature. It's a 2/2 with lower power. Okay, 2 is less than 3. All right, I'll put the counter on it, and now it's a 3/3. Now, there's some rules stuff here, though, that's kind of interesting. So that restriction is not just a targeting restriction. It's also a restriction on resolution.
Right. I was going to say it checks on resolution is kind of the technical term.
Exactly. And that's a big deal. Yeah. Right? I mean, that's a game changer.
Especially since you can be expected to have multiple Mentor creatures in the same deck. You're playing Boros, right? And so let's say you attack with a 2/2, a 3/3 Mentor, and a 4/4 Mentor. If you
My mind just melted, by the way.
Right. If you get the order wrong, and this is going to be a little bit more consequential on Magic Online because you actually just have to stack the triggers and there's no takebacks. Where as in paper, and this is actually a pretty good difference to discuss. So let's say you attack with those three. Remember, a 2/2, a 3/3 with Mentor, and a 4/4 with Mentor. If you stack it so that the 4/4 with Mentor makes your 2/2 into a 3/3, your 3/3 with Mentor is no longer going to work on it.
That's right.
And on Magic Online, if you just clicked it in the wrong order, you'd be out of luck.
Yep, you would. You'd miss out on a +1/+1 counter. And, I think that one thing we should say before you continue is that these counters are really important, right? I mean, there's a difference between you having a block or your opponent having a clean block and not. Right. So they really do matter. So, okay, go on.
But in paper, the way it doesn't actually work, you don't have to be quite that specific where like you can just say, put the counter on with the 3/3, then put the counter on with the 4/4.
Yes, you can verbalize what your intention is, and that's considered good enough.
Yes. The technical ways you want to put the 3/3 on the stack and then put the 4/4 on the stack. You want to put the 4/4 on the stack, then the 3/3 on the stack. Resolve the 3/3 first, then resolve the 4/4.
That's right. So this is pretty tricky business. The thing that you need to remember is that when the Mentor trigger targets the thing, it has to be legal. And when it resolves, it has to be legal, meaning that it has to have a lower power. And anything that changes that dynamic means that the ability will fizzle. So you always have to remember that both of those things happen. Now, if you only have one Mentor creature, this becomes a lot easier. You don't really need
it's
to
really
worry
the multiple Mentor creatures that can make a difference. Or if like you attack with a 2/2 and a 3/3 Mentor, and your opponent, after you've already declared attacks before Mentor resolves, they're like, okay, shock your 2/2, and you give it +2/+2 with a combat trick. Remember, the Mentor is just not going to work.
Right. Yeah, that's a perfect example. And so, yeah, go ahead.
As an opponent, that might be a good time to do that as well, because you might get them to make an attack that doesn't work out quite as well.
Yeah. So Mentor, pretty straightforward in what it's trying to do, but the implementation can be a little bit tricky. So just make sure that you get that down in your head first and understand how it works. Just lay out like what Luis just mentioned, a 4/4 with Mentor, just make it up, just put it on a Post-it note or whatever, a 3/2 with Mentor and a 2/2 attacker, and send them all in and go, okay, I'm going to talk through exactly what needs to happen here. And then you'll go, oh, I see. And just remember, again, it has to be legal when it targets and when it resolves.
And Mentor is also going to inform your deck building. Because let's say, you've got 2 mana, 2/2 Mentor. That card makes me want, 1/1 flyers. And
totally,
it turns out the 1/1 flyer in the set has lifelink, which already, I think, makes it probably good enough. But that's the kind of card that alarm bells go off. I'm like, oh, Mentor, yes. Because you are going to want to lay out your curve and make it so that your mentors have students. You're going to be able to successfully put +1/+1 counters on things, and that does up the value of 1/1s you might previously overlook. Like even 1/1 first strike for one. That's traditionally not a very good card. It was actually Boros Recruit back in original Ravnica as a hybrid mana for a 1/1 first strike. If you have 3 mentor creatures that are on 2, which is unlikely, but let's say you have like 4 or 5 mentor creatures total, that card becomes a lot more appealing.
Oh, totally. Like it can pick up 2 counters in some scenarios and just bash.
Another interaction that's really important is, let's say you have a 3/3 and a 3/3 mentor. If you have a combat trick in your hand, depending on what your opponent has, it might be right to just go cast my instant, give my mentor +2/+2, then attack with both.
Oh, sure. So because it won't trigger if there's no target, right?
It will not trigger if the power is uneven. So like one of the things you can't do is if you have a 3/3 with mentor, a 3/3, and a 4/4 with mentor, you can't attack with all 3, make the 3/3 mentor into a 4/4, and then put the counter on the 3/3 because it will never have triggered to begin with.
Right.
So this is going to be a confusing ability in terms of how it plays out, and I suspect there will be a lot of people who are disappointed when they ultimately don't get counters when these games play out. So really just remember that it's has to be smaller to trigger to begin with, and has to be true when the ability resolves, because it's not like super complicated when you look at it that way, but needing to meet the requirements coming in and coming out is gonna cause some problems, especially if you, like you said, had multiple mentor creatures, which these decks push you to have.
Yeah. That situation will come up. So keep your eye out for that. Selesnya is our last one of the spotlights here. It's bringing back one that we've actually had before in M15 and back in Ravnica City of Guilds. Is called Convoke. And it has one of the best lines of like rules text. I love this. It says, your creatures can help cast this spell. It's like, oh, thanks, guys. It basically lets your creatures tap for 1 mana each to cast spells with Convoke. You can tap any untapped creature, even ones with summoning sickness, and use that creature to pay for any color of mana that creature is, or for generic mana if it's not relevant. Of course, this, just to know, this doesn't change when you can cast the Convoke spell. It's only how you're paying for it. And it doesn't change the converted mana cost of the spell when it's on the stack. It's not like it's getting cheaper by doing that. It's just you're paying for it with a different source of mana that only Convoke spells can have. And you can pay for some or all of the casting cost with the Convoke ability. You can pay for just one of it, or you can even use tap only creatures to pay for whatever the Convoke spell is. Convoke, we're going to talk about it in a few minutes when we're going to do kind of an overview, just a brief touch in on each of the guilds. But it is a pretty cool mechanic that lets you power out some pretty huge creatures way quicker than you'd normally be able to.
And once you have, one of the cool things, I love drafting Convoke decks in original Ravnica. I didn't like it quite as much in like 13 or whatever, because
15
because triplicate spirits was nonsense. But
it was stupid. Yeah.
What happens if you draft enough Convoke creatures is, imagine every creature in your deck had the subtext: tap, add 1 mana to your mana pool. All your creatures are mana realms. Creatures get a lot better when you put it that way, and it makes it so you want to play 1 mana 1/1s with no text more frequently than before, which is to say, ever instead of never.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and Convoke might look a little pedestrian, but if you build the deck around it, it can be absolutely explosive and put huge pressure on your opponent. So don't sleep on Convoke just because they're bringing it back and just because it's like, okay, what? I get a little bit cheaper on me? No, you can absolutely just dump your hand on the battlefield. It can be pretty cool. There's 2 other things for this set that are non-guild specific that are coming that you may not have seen before. So we're just going to touch on quickly here. The first one is hybrid mana. And these are the ones with the mana symbols that look like a normal mana symbol that's been kind of split in half on a diagonal. And it has 2 colors of mana on that symbol, 1 on each side. The basics of it are that hybrid mana make spells easier to cast, since you can choose any color, either color, to fulfill that 1 pip of mana, but they do count as both colors regardless of whether you pay for it. So in other words, it's still a gold card, even though it kind of like, I only paid for black for this, whatever, like Deathrite Shaman's probably the most famous.
The good thing about this is, for the most part, I think correctly, Ravnica is not going to have a ton of color matters cards, because it's kind of nonsensical to have like destroy target black creature, and then your green white opponent just has multiple black creatures in their deck because of hybrid mana.
Sure, right.
So I think it's generally going to be. I mean, again, I don't have the full set in front of me. I don't know every card there, but I imagine you won't have to like know that to be able to interact with this limited format. It's a good point. I mean, it is true.
Yeah,
but it's really dubious to make like a protection from green creature in the set where there could just be hybrid cards in their like blue black deck that are green.
That's right. The other thing that you may not have seen if you're relatively new back to Magic, they're called split cards. They've actually come out in many different forms by now, so you've probably seen them. But basically, these are the cards that look like if you take a Magic card and turn it sideways, and there's 2 little tiny Magic cards on the screen, on the printed on the front of the card. That's what these are. The key is that for these ones, you have to pick one of the halves to cast, and you can't choose both. There was a version called Fuse that lets you do both if you wanted, but this one, they're not like that. So it's 1 card and another card, and when you cast it, you choose which of the 2 cards you're casting at that time. When you do cast one, it goes on the stack as just the half of the card you're casting, and the other half is just ignored, which is kind of interesting because you're obviously still holding the card, in your hand, but it is actually just treating it as if the 1 half that you decided to cast is on the stack. Split cards are single cards for the purposes of discarding and such. So don't get any, it's definitely grifter to try to discard 1 split card to like a Mind Rot or whatever. Yes. It's still just 1 card. So don't get it twisted on that. The interesting thing that doesn't come up super often, but might, is that when a split card is not on the stack, the split card has the combined characteristics of both cards, which means that it's probably a gold card. I mean, there can be split cards that are just all green, but many of them, and the ones in this set are going to be gold. And then also its converted mana cost is the combined cost of the two cards. That's actually a little bit newer. So even if you have been playing for a while, you should be aware of that. Again, this is more corner case stuff. I don't expect it to come up a lot, but you should be aware that is if a card cares about converted mana cost, say of something in your graveyard, it's actually you add the two mana costs together for split cards.
Yeah, and
again, split cards are kind of cool, right?
Yeah, split cards are sweet. They're a lot of fun. Fire Ice, for example, is one of my favorite cards of all time. I wouldn't expect there to be much that cares about converted mana cost, again, for the same reasons as like the hybrid stuff. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Just play your split cards. They're pretty sweet. A lot of the ones that we've seen have hybrid on one side and single colors or, multicolors on the other. So it's like hybrid Selesnya mana on one side and just green-white on the other, which is kind of interesting because you might end up playing it in a deck where you can only play the half of it. And these split cards are kind of unique in that regard.
Right. And that's a great point to bring up because we should mention, and of course we'll cover these when we do them in the set review, but it is really important to note that both halves do not have to be great in order for you to play the split card.
Yeah. Flexibility is
if really you have valuable. One half yes, you really, really would prefer to have access to both halves. But if your deck can only cast one half, but that half is very good, play it. That's fine. You don't need to do that. Generally speaking, they tend to reduce the power level of each half because you're getting the flexibility, but you never know. And if there's one that just says like destroy a creature, hey, you can play that, and you don't need to even worry about the other side if you can't cast it. Okay, let's just get some first impressions of each guild. We've obviously don't have like a super thorough understanding of how these things work. But, you and I, Luis, have played enough Ravnica style stuff at this point to be able to go, this is probably where these things are going. We'll start off with Dimir. And I assume this is going to be my favorite guild of this bunch. It has a bunch of library manipulation built into it, thanks to Surveil, which is kind of its main mechanic on a bunch of commons. It looks like, just so the one's spoiled already. There's 3 commons that I found that all have Surveil 1 or 2 on them. And it has some nice crossover stuff with Golgari and Izzet, both of which want certain cards to be put in the graveyard for value. We talked about jumpstart cards that you can flash back, and of course creatures for Undergrowth as well. And like one of the cards that I saw is called Dimir Informant. It's 2 and a blue for a 1/4 human rogue at common, and it has when it enters the battlefield, Surveil 2, which I'm kind of interested in.
Yeah, that card looks great. I think it's going to be quite strong. Surveil is the kind of mechanic that you don't need to do anything to make it good, right? Like, if you have a 2/2 mentor, better put 1 power creatures in your deck or it's blank. If you have Undergrowth and you don't work towards it, you're going to end up with 4 mana 1/1s. On the other hand, Dimir Informant, 2 and a blue, 1/4, enter the battlefield, Surveil 2. This is a card that every single blue deck's going to put in their deck and be very happy about. Another card, Unexplained Disappearance, 1 and a blue, instant, return to our creature's owner's hand, Surveil 1. I'm just going to always play that card. It's always going to be great.
Yep.
Where it gets a little more interesting for Dimir is the cards that actually care specifically about Surveil. Like,
see some build around or something, right?
There's a card, it's blowing my mind. This card's common, by the way. Yeah, Darkblade Agent is a 1 blue black for a 2/3. And it says, as long as you surveilled this turn, Darkblade Agent has Death Touch, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. It's like, first of all, it's a common.
That's a common?
Yes.
Holy crap.
But this card is a 3 mana 2/3 Death Touch card drawer if you have enough Surveil cards. And if you attack with this and they have, let's say, a 1/4 and you have this 2/3, they're put in a situation where they can block, and if you have a Surveil card, you just kill their creature. But if they don't block, you can still just play the Surveil card and draw a card. So, yeah, this is the kind of card that's really going to make the Dimir decks tick, even though, and, they also have like a 2 mana 1/3 that whenever you Surveil, you drain your opponent for 1, that sort of thing. So,
yeah, that one's an uncommon.
Yeah, it is. Dimir looks like it's going to be a pretty good deck. I mean, again, we don't know the full context, but because this mechanic cries out like, well, I'm great by itself. These cards are all good. And then I also have some cards that, pay me off for surveilling a thing I already wanted to do. So it's like one of the lowest investment mechanics. I think it's actually the lowest investment mechanic besides maybe Jumpstart. That one's also pretty easy to imagine it just being good.
Yeah. And that really stands out because when we talk about some of the other ones, you'll be like, wow, I really have to go out of my way to get these creatures in the graveyard, where this one just asks nothing of you. It's rewarding you for doing something.
And it works really nicely with multiple other set mechanics, which is cool.
Yeah, I think that's a really neat little cross section there, and I'm curious to see how it goes over. Next one is Izzet. And Izzet is, generally speaking, kind of finicky, right? Like these decks tend to want a bunch of instants and sorceries, but they also want some type of way to finish the game. And they sometimes can have some awkward crossovers. Like, where do the red aggro cards from Boros fit into this? Some of the more controlling cards from the Dimir, the blue side of Dimir might fit in, but like these decks tend to be these weird, hit you with a whole bunch of stuff in one turn type decks where they kind of tempo you out. You know, you feel like you're doing fine, and then they're like 6 you with this weird creature that gets pumped and this incidental damage spell, and you're like, oh, okay. And then they like tap down your thing and then 6 you again, and you're like, crap, I'm going to die next turn if I don't have anything. And, you know, that tends to be how these type of decks go.
Yeah, Izzet's always a little confused, which is kind of, you know, on flavor for Izzet.
Part of the deal,
like you have, you know, draw 2 with Jumpstart, deal 2 with Jumpstart, and you're like, oh, that looks like a good blue-red control deck. But then it's like, tap target creature and deal 2 to that creature's controller with Jumpstart, and it's like, oh, well,
that's a gold card.
That's a beatdown card.
Common, yeah.
Well, you know, like they have
right.
the, you know, they had the Nivik Cyclops back in Return to Ravnica, and here they have the Piston Fist Cyclops, 1 blue-red hybrid, so 3 mana, 4/3 defender. But if you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it can attack this turn. So you have these like cards that flip between offense and defense pretty nicely. And it's hard to play against because you never know whether they're going to like control the game and, you know, beat you with this war of attrition, or all of a sudden just attack you for 10. Whereas on the other hand, it's also kind of hard to draft because you don't know that either when you're drafting.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to be willing to experiment, which is also on theme. I find that generally speaking, these Izzet decks are, much more difficult to put together in a consistent manner, but they do tend to peak pretty highly. Yeah. Like if you have one, there's games where you feel like you just couldn't.
I will say, looking at the Jumpstart cards, they're not very, they're solid, but none of them jump out at me as being awesome. Like the rates on this,
even Chemister's Insight is not.
These rates are just very modest. Like 3 mana, deal 2 to a creature's sorcery. Like, yeah, that card's good. You're always going to play it. Direct Current, right? 1 red, deal 2, sorcery, Jumpstart. But I guess it's deal 2 to any target. Could hit players also, but like, that's just not like, wow, that's awesome. Whereas like some of these Dimir cards like look very strong, and you know, you have these like Selesnya cards that like you basically, all the other guilds have these cards that really make me think like, wow, that's going to be really sick if you get it going. And Izzet's just not standing out like that. So we'll see how it ends up. Like Izzet tends to be the hardest deck to draft and one of the, like you said, the highest peak, highest reward, but it's going to, I think, take a while before you figure out what exactly that's supposed to look like. Whereas Selesnya, it's like, wow, I've got 3 Siege Worms, which is back again, and, you know, a bunch of cheap token enablers. Like, my deck's going to be great. And it's not that hard to figure out that's what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. And that is the thing, is that we will figure that out about Izzet as we go. But for now, it's like very difficult to say just looking at individual cards. Next is Golgari, which is, again, I mentioned it before, but this is very card dependent. Like, you can tell me you have a sweet Undergrowth deck or that you can get a lot of Undergrowth going, but until I know which Undergrowth cards you have, I don't know how good your deck is. Like, I might have a lot of self-mill or something like that, but that doesn't mean my Golgari deck's automatically good, right? Like, I need the payoffs. I need to have found the worthy and good payoffs to do it. That said, the fallback plan for green-black is kind of fine, right? It's like the classic mid-range. It has removal. It'll have some decent creatures. You might get a little bit of synergy going with Undergrowth, even if you're not all in on it. And that's pretty good. Like, you can still, you know, win games just by casting spells and removing their stuff and doing that. But this one definitely seems to be one of the most difficult. Like, this one, the common that they have with Undergrowth is Moodmark Painter. It's 2 black for a 2/3. And when it enters the battlefield, target creature gets menace and +X+0 until end of turn, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard.
Right. So that,
like, it's like a aggro 4
that card, I mean,
it's weird.
It's not a good defensive card. It's 4 mana, 2/3. And if you're spending a bunch of time putting creatures in your graveyard, you might not have hit their life total much. So even if this is giving like +4/+0, that means you're attacking them for 8 down to 12. Like, Golgari seems like it could be a little confused, though. I imagine it's going to end up more like mid-range / control than aggro, because it just takes a while to get this engine going. But then you've got like the gold common, the Rhizome Lurcher. It's 2 green-black for a 2/2, but it also, when it enters the battlefield, gets a ++1 counter equal number of creatures in your graveyard. So if you can put 5 creatures in your graveyard and you have these like 4 mana 7/7s, then yeah, you're eventually going to kill your opponent. But how did you put those creatures in the graveyard to begin with? What are you spending your first 3 or 4 turns on? And I think that my answer is that this is not going to be a beatdown deck.
No. And, you were talking about how in Dimir, it's making it easy, right? It's like, hey, do you want to surveil? Sure. Do you want to get paid off for it? Yeah. Right. And then in Izzet, it's like, well, you're going to be playing instants and sorceries and getting some type of benefits from it, but the game plan isn't really clear. In Golgari, it's kind of like the opposite of the Dimir thing, where it's like, hey, do you want to find ways to get creatures in your graveyard? You're like, well, no, not really.
Not
like,
intrinsically.
well, how about
no.
we give you yeah. And how do you want to get do you want a mediocre payoff like Moodmark Painter? It's like, well, no, I don't really want a 2/3 for 2 black in my deck, that might not even get my creature through for damage. So I really think the payoffs are going to matter, or it might just be that they're incidental. And like, for example, the split card in this is called Status Statue. Status is a green-black hybrid. Its historic creature gets +1/+1 and gains death touch until end of turn at instant speed. But Statue, this is a perfect example I was talking about before. Statue is 2 black-green instant, destroy target artifact, creature, or enchantment.
Yep.
Like, you're just running that thing no matter what.
Mini rant here. I actually really dislike the naming conventions of the split cards, the set.
They went for alliteration? Is that all it is?
The first 3 letters of every word are the same. So status, statue, discovery, dispel, invert, invent. I don't think it's actually good. I mean, I really dislike it personally. Like, it makes the words sound very similar to each other, and I don't find it to be a particularly compelling hook. Fire Ice, that is sweet. And like, look, I understand, like, stand and deliver. Like, it's there is a finite well of names to draw from, and not every split card in the world can have, this connection that a lot of the split cards did. Dead and Gone, far and away, like all of these phrases.
Well, yeah, because some of them had the and thing, which like for the whole set, like Fire and Ice, like those were all and then remember we had the 2 from for the Aftermath cards.
Dust to
so
Dawn.
it was like never to return. Right?
And
those were all
you
could just put a 2 for the whole set. Yeah.
The gimmick of like they all start with the same 3 letters is just like not doing it for me. So
yeah, it doesn't really fly. I feel weird reading it. Like, oh, he casts Status Statue.
Yeah.
Huh?
It just doesn't flow off the tongue. And then in gameplay, when someone announces it, it's like, at least they have a different mana cost, but like, are you casting Find or Finality? Or, are you casting Assurance or Association?
She statued the ever loving, it's like, what?
But these cards are good though. Like the ones that, have the hybrid half as just straight up what always plays are really sweet. Like, like Status, 1 green black hybrid, so 1 mana. Target creature gets ++1 and death touch, like as an instant. That's a card I would consider playing, by itself.
Oh yeah, especially for 1 mana. Yeah.
And, Integrity,
So
right?
anyway,
1 red white mana, target creature gets +2/+2 instant. You just put that card in any red or white deck that has a lot of creatures in it. So.
Yeah. But yeah, so Golgari, I think it's going to be the most finicky, and I think it's going to be the type of thing where you just need to add up the power level of the cards in the deck more than others. And I'm really curious to see about if Undergrowth ends up being something that you really go for or that you just kind of get a bonus for sometimes. Boros. Boros is the most predictable of all the guilds. The primary plan is to beat down, and usually there's no other plan at all. Like they're just all in on getting you dead as quickly as possible. Mentor is a little tricky, as we mentioned, but it rewards aggression in a big way, right? I mean, it rewards attacking. Both creatures need to be attacking. You need to be able to get these creatures turned sideways in order to start utilizing Mentor. And if you can't, a lot of these cards are pretty underpowered, right? There's a 5 mana 4/2 with Mentor and Haste. There's a 3 mana 3/1 with Mentor. If you don't ever get to turn these cards sideways, they're pretty bad return, as far as rate goes for those cards. The thing is that you need to have this combo of these smaller creatures, ideally with evasion, to go with these bigger mentor cards, because it feels to me like if I attack with Blade Instructor, 2 white for a 3/1 soldier with mentor at common, and I get to put a counter on something smaller, like we mentioned, and I actually have it here too, Healer's Hawk, white for a 1/1 flying lifelink. If I get to put a counter on that and Blade Instructor trades off for something on the ground, I think I'm fine with that. Like that's a reasonable transaction for my card, but I need to get myself to the spot where I have the smaller creature that's not going to die in combat and then also get the counter. And then I was thinking about it. If you have enough combat tricks to like push through multiple mentor triggers, I feel like the game's going to end like pretty quickly after that.
Well, the other thing that mentor does is because it's an ability that gives you value every time you attack, your opponent's really incentivized to block. When you attack your Blade Instructor, it's almost like they're forced to block. I mean, they're not strictly forced, but they're gonna block it. And that means that combat tricks have much higher value in mentor decks than they would have otherwise.
Yeah. Now, mentor does have a ceiling on it, though, right? I mean, there's not going to be many boards where you can attack, let's say, 3 times with your mentor creature and get counters moved over a bunch of things that are actually surviving combat. And one of the cards that kind of made me think of that was Parhelion Patrol. It's 3 and a white for a 2/3 fine vigilance with mentor. That's a 2-powered mentor creature. Well, right. That's pretty tough to, it can get a creature, it can get a counter on a 0 or 1 powered creature. But after that,
the joke really is you have to mentor onto this so it can then mentor. It's just like real life.
Yes.
You teach someone, then they teach someone else.
I like that. It's the army kind of propagating its message throughout the ranks. And then I mentioned this too, and you did earlier, but Healer's Hawk just looks like a low-key all-star for this deck. I feel like you want to start off with the 1/1 flying lifelink.
Yeah, I think that card's going to be really good in this set.
I do too. I automatically think that 1/1 flying lifelink is playable. Like it's annoying
it's
enough
be great in Selesnya too.
Picks up any equipment.
It's a mana elf that can get in for 1 point of lifelink a turn when you're not convoking with it.
Yeah, and there's +1/+1 counters. Let's talk about Selesnya because that's about it for Boros. It's pretty straightforward. Convoke is kind of interesting because it crosses these sort of like 2 strategies with each other that feel a little bit at odds with each other. But when you sit across from them, it looks pretty good. Namely, you want a bunch of cheap, small creatures, maybe a cheap token maker if there's one in the set, or, cards like Healer's Hawk that we mentioned, or Hunted Witness, which is white for a 1/1 human. And when it dies, you get a 1/1 soldier with lifelink. These 1-drops all of a sudden go up in value because you want these on the ground, and then boom, you start slamming these monstrous 7 and 8 mana, even 9 mana, Convoke creatures way ahead of schedule with things like, you mentioned Siege Worm, 5/5 trample for 7 mana, 5 green, but it has Convoke. So you can get that thing down on turn 4 or even sooner, depending on what else is in the set, but like a turn 4 5/5 tramplers, like, holy crap, like how am I going to beat that? Right. Those things demand an immediate answer. And the play pattern ends up being something like, if you get to do what you're doing, you play a bunch of small things, you play a huge thing, they're forced to answer the huge thing. If they do, then you still have the small things that you can either leverage to cast more or start attacking.
Oh yeah. And one of the cool things about the Selesnya decks is you'll do like, play 3 creatures out, convoke a Siege Worm, and then you're in a position where you can attack with everything. And if they eat one of the small things, they just take so much damage that you can just keep swarming them. Or you just power out 2 Siege Worms and kill them that way. And a cool overlap. One of the coolest things about all the Ravnica sets is the overlap between guilds. I think Undergrowth and Selesnya are going to overlap nicely too, because what goes well with attacking with a bunch of small creatures and having them kill them? It's casting your overgrowth cards afterwards. Undergrowth.
You're now they become your finishers.
I keep saying overgrowth. It's undergrowth. Undergrowth.
It is undergrowth. Yeah. Yeah. But Selesnya, when I think of these, I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to the common Convoke cards, because those are the ones that you're going to see most often. And I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to what the desirable 1 and 2 mana cards are, and if there's any token makers at the 2 or 3 mana slot, because those are the ones that if you can get 2 or 3 creatures out of them, those let you hammer down these massive threats way early. And that is especially in Modern Era Limited, where, normally speaking, you don't have removal spells that only cost 2 mana. Like if you wanted to say kill a 5/5 with trample, the average amount of mana you'd have to spend these days is about 5. Right. You need something along the lines of the 5 mana black sorcery, or maybe a red one that does 5 damage or something like that. And boy, if they don't have that, they're either putting 3 creatures in front of it and praying you don't have a combat trick, or they're just going to lose to it. So these Convoke decks can be absolutely explosive. But you really do have to kind of build towards Convoke to make it work.
You can't just put 2 siege rooms in your deck and not play 1-drops and 2-drops and expect that to go well.
Right. Big picture style, Luis, before we take off for the show here. I'm really stoked about this set, man. I don't think I realized, like, I played a fair bit of M19, and, we mentioned in the sunset, it's like, okay, move along. Like you were here, you did your core set thing, and now I'm kind of ready. But boy, just looking at the spoiled cards from Guilds is like, oh, right. Yeah. Complicated cards with a lot of crazy stuff going on. And I'm like trying to ramp my brain back up to get into that mode. But I got to tell you, I think I missed it more than I realized.
Yeah, I'm really excited. One thing we didn't mention, by the way, is there's a gate in every pack. So.
Oh, is it? So I didn't actually know that. I tried to look it up and I couldn't see it right away, but then I had to go. I'm really glad you brought that up. So there will be a dual land gate in every pack. Okay.
And first of all, it makes it so your 2-color fixing is better. Second, that makes it so playing 3 colors seems pretty doable. And one of the things that often happens in the Ravnica sets is you'll be like, you're Dimir, but you're splashing green for a powerful Golgari card. And the gold cards lend themselves very well to that sort of thing. Like Molder Hulk, for example, is the 7 green-black for a 6/6 Undergrowth. It costs 1 less for each creature in your graveyard, and then when it enters the battlefield, you return a land from your graveyard into play. That card looks pretty good in a Surveil deck. So if you're like Dimir Surveil, and then you end up with, 2 Golgari Guild Gates, and you can play like a forest, and you're in pretty good shape to just cast this 3 mana 6/6 if it happens late enough in the game. And that sort of thing is going to be pretty common. So I think having extra fixing is just going to make the format better. People tend to, I tend to enjoy formats with a lot more fixing.
Do you anticipate, based on what you know from prior Ravnica sets, that the decks will commonly be just sticking to a guild, or that they will reach out into another guild, or even that they could be 4 or 5 colors or something crazy?
I'm guessing more 3-color. Basically, the most common is 2 colors. Some 3 colors, not a whole lot of 4 or 5 color, because all the 2-color fixing, I think, lends itself more to 3 colors than 4. And 3 colors also can, I just talked about like Golgari Dimir overlap, or Boros Izzet overlap. Like that, you get these nice 2 guilds. Adding a 4th color, I think, is going to be a little trickier to manage.
Okay. And then, so we've got the guild gates and then the lockets that we had.
Oh, and the lockets are quite strong as well. The extra power of these are the 3 mana artifacts that tap for 1 of each color, or tap for either color of your guild, and you can pay 4 hybrid mana of the guild and sack it to draw 2 cards. That's just a really powerful mana artifact. So not every deck's going to want them, like the Boros beatdown decks aren't, but the fact that they're a draw 2 later in the game means it's a really easy way to just have extra mana sources, have extra fixing, and have a good late game plan.
That's right. All right. Well, next week we're coming in hot. We've got the Guilds of Ravnica set review to bring you. We're going to cover every single common and uncommon in the set. I'm excited for this one. I think there's going to be some really spicy stuff. They tend to kind of take the gloves off when it comes to these guild sets, because they say, hey, we're allowed to do gold. The uncommons are going to be complicated and powerful, and anything rare or above could have any amount of text that they choose with these type of cards. And they've really pushed the boundaries. I've seen some of the previews with some pretty crazy mana costs, blue, blue, black, black, or red, 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 blue, 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 these type of like really intense mana costs that we've never seen before. And I'm excited to talk about those. So we will see you for that next week. Before we go, I want to remind you, our sponsor is channelfireball.com. That's the place to go for all things Magic related, including pre-ordering Guilds of Ravnica right now. If you need money for cards, you can also sell your cards back to them. And this is a pretty easy process. You just go on CFB, fill out your order, send in the cards. And if you want, you can trade them in for store credit. If you do so, you're going to get 30% back. That goes a long way towards a new box of Guilds of Ravnica to draft with your friends and that kind of thing after the pre-releases and stuff get rolling. So make sure you check that out. If you want to find anything related to the podcast, including every episode ever, lrcast.com is where you want to go for that. You can go back through the archives and listen to the Return to Ravnica stuff that we did on the show. We weren't doing the show when original Ravnica came out, but maybe you can learn something from that, or any of our sweet level up shows or anything like that from the past. You can find them there. I'm Marshall_LR on social media, and Luis is LSV. See you next week.
So this is going to be short and sweet, but I have a cool life hack for everyone. So,
I like
something that has made me a lot happier, and I think made a lot of other people happier too. So I don't like giving gifts when you're supposed to give gifts. Like, I'm not a big fan of like, okay, you have to give someone a gift for Christmas or their birthday or what have you. What I like is finding the perfect gift for people, and what I really like is finding gifts for no reason for people. And one of the things I've found that I think has just been a really good positive influence is if I see a something that's perfect for someone, I'll just get it. And I'm not talking like I buy all these extravagant gifts, but like I saw a bottle opener that really reminded me of Webb, David Ochoa, one of our friends. And I just got it for him. And the next time I saw him, I gave it to him as a gift. And it's the sort of thing that cost me like $10. And it lets the person know that A, you're thinking of them, B, that you know enough about what they like to pick out a good gift for them, and C, it just makes them happy because everyone likes getting gifts. And it's the sort of thing that I really like doing. I don't have any expectation of getting any gifts back or anything like that. The idea is not to put people on the spot in any way, but it's the sort of thing that really has made me happier. And, if it doesn't make you happy, it doesn't make you happy. I'm not saying you got to do this, but it's the sort of thing where I don't know, I like showing the people I care about that I care about them. And one way to do that is when you see something you think they would like, just get it for them. That includes like, when I'm at a tournament, I'll often just get, I know a lot of my friends like Starbucks order, and I'll just get a bunch of drinks. Like you've seen me at tournaments just holding like 4 or 5 drinks.
Seen you. You've brought me a lot of Arnold Palmers.
I don't even ask you. I just
you've nursed me through a lot of early mornings that I didn't even know were
like
coming.
When I'm doing coverage with like, you and Huey, I just show up with the drinks that you two like. And I find that to be the sort of thing that propagates itself, where I've noticed the more I do that, the more other people will do that too. And you get into this like virtuous cycle of both of you being happier. Like I enjoy a coffee that someone got me without me asking, without me paying any of those things, way more than one that I went out and got for myself. Like BDM and I have an agreement. Whenever we're both working coverage and we get a coffee, we just always get the other person a coffee. There's no downside. The coffee will get consumed.
Yes. With you two, easily.
And it's the sort of thing which I find it just, net happiness. And again, a really important part is not to expect reciprocity. Like it'll happen and it's great when it does. But the idea isn't, to make someone feel like they're supposed to do something, because they're really not supposed to. Like it's totally fine if they don't. But it's just a cool thing to do. And you'd be surprised by how little you have to spend in order to get a really good return in terms of happiness. Just buying someone a $5 trinket that lets them know like, hey, I pay attention and I know that you like X, and I saw this thing and I thought of you and I got you X. It's just a really cool thing to do. And I don't know.
Really
I found,
such high value too.
Yeah. Like I said, it's just such good value. It makes it, it just makes everyone happier. Like another example is, German wild Nicodel's wildest Nicodel.
Wildest Nicodel.
Not the thing you said. It's wildest Nicodel. And I went a couple years ago when we were all playing it in Zoo. CFB played Wild Nicodel every single tournament for like 2 years till it got banned in Modern. I went on the European Magic card market and I bought like 20 of them. And I just gave playsets of them to a bunch of the guys on my team, like Kibler and Pat Cox and Raptor, just because they always played Wild Nicodel and I thought it was cool. Like, yeah,
it's just great.
No particular reason. It wasn't for any reason at all, except I thought it was cool. And, Pat's Twitter handle's wildest Nicodel. Like, so it's just the sort of thing which I saw a very low, these things cost me like $1.50 each or something like that, whatever it was. It was not very much. And it was just a cool way to show my friends that I appreciated them. So I think that, if you're listening to this and this sounds cool, try like this next week, try doing that for someone that you want to show appreciation to. It's just a cool way to make their day brighter because it costs you very little. Compliments work the same way too. Just telling someone like, hey, that's a cool hat. I like your shoes, whatever. Like anything that you can compliment them, like, wow, that's a really cool drawing that you made. Like it's the sort of thing, it's very cheap to you to do that, but it means a lot to the other person. If you don't think that the random stranger you said, hey, those are really sweet shoes, and you just keep going, if they don't think about that later in the day and like, wow, that was sweet, like, then I think you'd be wrong. I think that people do care about that sort of thing.
Yeah,
so.
Definitely. That's great advice. I love it.